You're listening to Blossoming Technologist, a podcast for young professionals in tech, discovering skills, careers, and tips for being in the tech industry. I'm your host, Marissa, and today we're joined by Aman Agarwal, the founder and CEO at SANPRAM Transnational Corporation. Aman is also the host of two podcasts, The Age of AI and the Eccentric CEO, in which he interviews machine learning experts and CEOs. He also recently published his book called Tech Fluent CEO, which helps non-technical founders gain an understanding of technical concepts like databases, caching, and artificial intelligence. After reading his book, I can confidently say it's a great resource for any young professional starting in tech, whether an engineer or not. Today, we're going to dig into the technical concepts for non-technical people, such as computer systems and databases, using metaphors from Aman's book. Aman, welcome to the show.
Oh my God, thank you so much, Marissa, and very flattering of you to prepare that nice introduction. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks for being here. As we always start off, I want to ask you what first got you interested in the tech industry?
This is really interesting. So I was in college and I was one of those kids who's always thinking about money and how to make money and stuff like that. So I was just like in that little bubble of entrepreneurship and those kind of things. And so I was just always following what's happening in tech because that was the hot industry at the time, even now for the most part. But back then it was really hot and everybody was talking about Airbnb and the gig economy and the sharing economy and those kind of stuff. Now people are talking about Web3 and I don't know whatnot. But what I found most interesting is that like 200 years ago, 100 years ago, if you want to build a $1 billion company, it took you a lot more resources, a lot more time to get up to that scale of producing value, reaching that many customers and so on. And now with technology, like with the speed of light, you can really reach millions and millions of customers and you can do things that our ancestors never thought possible, right? That's what I found really interesting about tech. And so even though I was an engineer, I was studying electronics, which is tech, but not tech, you could say, right? I just switched over afterwards into the tech industry, like the software side. Yeah.
Yeah. So coming from software, what actually led you to becoming a CEO?
From the beginning of time that I remember being conscious, I knew that I was born to be an entrepreneur. It's just a DNA thing, I think, or something like that, right? My mom was an entrepreneur. My dad wasn't, but my mom was. And she also had a computer skills training institute back in the day. And when I was like 4 years old, I would teach. And back then, like people did not have computers, right? So at 4 years old, I was teaching people who would show up in the institute, like how to turn a computer on and things like that. So, I was kind of inculcated into the education industry from a very small age. Although I only connected that dot looking backwards now that I've published my book, halfway through writing it, I realized, whoa, my mom was doing the same thing. Like, that's cool. Like, I never thought about it for decades. But yeah, I always knew that I would be an entrepreneur. I never saw myself as a kid like, yeah, someday I would want to work at a big company. Like it was never like that. It was like, whenever I would hear about, you know what, your uncle is working at this company and he makes this much money, or your friend is getting a job or something like that, I was like, whoa, who's paying him that much? Like, that was always my thinking, like, whoa, people pay that much? Like, how do I pay people that much? Like that was it's just something I was born with, I would say.
Yeah. Oh, it's so interesting. And it's just so impressive that you are a CEO, you have two podcasts, you have a book now. Like, it's like, is there anything you can't do?
I'm still working on handstands, if that matters.
That answers the question. I've never been able to do a handstand either.
Okay.
So your book is called Tech Fluent CEO. I just read it, and as I mentioned in the beginning, I think all of our listeners read Aman's book. It is so good and breaks down technical concepts into really simple metaphors. We're going to jump into that shortly. But before we do that, Aman, what inspired you to actually write your book?
So I had been writing such articles explaining technology in simple words as a hobby for I think 7 years now. online. And I discovered that I had this little talent, interest, or skill, whatever you call it, right? I don't know what it is, but it's something I have that, yeah, I enjoy making fun analogies and metaphors and teach people about technology. Maybe I got it from my mother. I don't know. And so I thought, like, I'm not going to be a professional teacher, right? But I have this thing inside me, and so how do I get it out there that it's, like, it's something that's documented, just it's out there in the world, like, yeah, this is something that Aman was good at or knew how to do, and he put it out for the world to benefit from. And so it was more a way of me documenting, just like you have your podcast, right? You're documenting your passion for a certain thing, and maybe people like 5,000 years later can dig up a hard drive and find your episodes in there, right? So it's kind of the same philosophy of putting something that you are known for in, like, outside of you, so that it has a life of its own and it can travel much further than you can.
What made you decide to start writing articles in terms of metaphors, technically? Because I know you said you did that before even writing the book. You were writing articles, producing those, sharing those with people. What was that, like, tipping point that you were like, okay, like, I have this idea, let me share this with the world?
That is an even harder question, actually, because I have to think,
Really
like, why
dig
did I
in.
start writing? Why did I start writing? I mean, I loved writing, and you can probably see it from my book that I love to speak to people through my writing. I always address the reader directly, like you and I, and like that. So that's kind of like, yeah, and yeah, I love writing, and I'm passionate about technology, right? So I like writing, I like technology, I like sharing and teaching. And so it just kind of came together. My first articles were not even about technology per se. So I remember that my
Yeah.
very first article was about software outsourcing. So I had a job at a software outsourcing middleman company, and I just wrote a smaller article, like, for anybody who's interested in, like, outsourcing a software project, like, how do you do it properly, right? Or how do you not get burned while doing that? So I just put it out there on paper and thought, like, maybe it will get my company some customers. So I started with that. Then I wrote an article about how do you get a job after you've just graduated from college. Like, how do you get your first job, right? Because that was a problem that I had solved for myself, and I just wanted to share it with others. And it's like a really long 4,000, 5,000 word article about the
Oh my
mindset
God.
and different parts of, like, how do you think about finding a job out of college, even if it's not related to your major or anything. It's called College Seniors, how to land your first job, something like that. It's on Medium. So it just started from that, and then part of somewhere, yeah, things just happened. I like, so when I traveled to China, which you also did, I was mind blown by WeChat, which is an app that they have
Mm,
in China, which they use for pretty much everything, right? It's like Facebook, Venmo, PayPal, Twitter, all rolled into one in a way. And so I wrote a long walkthrough, like, oh, I found this really cool app, and here's all, like, it has like 100 screenshots or something like that. So I just started sharing more and more, and soon it found its own way into writing long technical explainer articles.
yeah. That's awesome. Oh, so cool. So, with your book, I know that the main purpose is aiming it at CEOs and entrepreneurs who are non-technical. And you mentioned, I want to say it was on LinkedIn or something. I do a lot of research for guests, as you probably do when you're
Thank you.
podcasting. And I don't remember where I found it, but you said that non-technical entrepreneurs or professionals has kind of become a badge of shame. Can
Mhm.
you talk about what that means and why you think that's the case?
So, first of all, I don't think there's anybody who feels proud to say, oh, I'm a non technical entrepreneur, founder, whatever, right? Like, I don't think that's like anything to be, it's kind of like defining by something that you are not, like, oh, I'm
Yeah.
not technical. And so I've personally I have friends who are entrepreneurs, and some of them tell me that they have this anxiety or they have this insecurity that if they're starting a tech company and some investor will laugh them out of the room, or like, oh, you're not even technical, like, what do you know, or something like that. Or I've had multiple people tell me how they hired some technical help, like engineers, and the engineer would look down on them or talk down to them when they find it hard to understand certain things. And I do mention this in my book as well, where I felt like there's also like a bias against non-technical founders, I think, At least in Silicon Valley, I've seen it where a lot of people will see, oh, are you technical? Like, are you non-technical? And they'll then decide how much respect they want to give you based on, whether you're technical or
Dang.
non-technical, something like that. I mean, that's kind of my world, what I've experienced, but other people might have a different experience as well. Like, I do know many engineers who are very patient, very kind, very nice and they love teaching and they love explaining. But I also know engineers, and I find such people sometimes online on Reddit or in common threads where they're like, oh, anybody who's not smart enough to code, like they should, I don't know, whatever, right? So it's
Yeah.
kind of like, I do know that fringe exists, which kind of maybe pollutes the pond for everybody else. But I do think that a lot of people deeply feel it, and they deeply feel the stacks against them because they're non-technical.
Yeah. So, how can CEOs benefit from having technical knowledge?
So the interesting thing is, if you look back to the 1500s, right, or even the 1600s or so forth, like the science of accounting, which is today a very widespread and very straightforward business practice. Everybody knows what accounting is. This accounting, the science and art of accounting, actually came up at a time when people were just using like what a back of the envelope calculations for knowing, like, for storing transactions and keeping their books, right? And most people did not have bookkeepers. They did not really care. They were like merchants, like, yeah, I trade something with somebody and he pays me and we're done, like we're golden, transaction over, move on to the next transaction, right? That's what historically trading has been all about, where you get paid, you perform a service, you deliver a product, and boom, you're good. And as businesses became much more complex and finance turned like, and maybe I'm taking the long way to like answer your question, but I'm going to get to that in a second, but I promise. uh, Today, if you take an MBA program or any business, if you pick up any business book, it has accounting as something that every business person, every CEO, that they need to know. If there's something wrong with your books, you need to know as a CEO. Like, you can't be a business owner. Some of the audience, maybe you know your parents or one of your parents or your uncles know, like, deal with bookkeeping and stuff like that in your family. And that's kind of like accepted knowledge that, yeah, if you have some business acumen, you have to understand what accounting it is and how it works, even if you're not an accountant, even if you're not a finance person, right? You need to know what credit is, what debit is, what an asset is, what a liability is, so on and so forth. And I think the same is now true for technology, where there are very few companies, and there are fewer companies every year which do not use technology or will not use technology as a core part of their business, right? It used to be that technology was all about, like, yeah, what software do you buy, right? Or like, hey, the
Yeah.
IT, we have some IT people in the company and they set up the computers and the internet, and they give us our emails, right? And that was the extent of what technology was meant for most CEOs. Like, yeah, there's the IT department or the procurement department, like you buy software that I use for whatever purpose, right? But now the business model for companies itself, like going from, like, take Amazon for instance, or Netflix, right, where they start with a DVD by mail service, or I don't know how old some people are, but if you want to book a cab, you used to call up the cab booking service, and then you had to say, hey, can you send me a car with a driver at this time for this purpose, and so on and so forth. I mean, in New York and in the US, in most places, you can get a cab just by hooting on the street. But here, you have to kind of like call people up, or had to call people up. And then you say, oh, why do I have all this overhead? Why don't I just create an app and people can just find each other by these asynchronous, like, messaging, which happens over the internet, right? And so I think digital technologies are really becoming part of businesses, and they're becoming so important that soon it's going to be like, okay, if you understand accounting, you need to understand technology as well. So it's going to be a core business skill that's going to be taught in every MBA school, every bachelor of business degree, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I wonder, do you feel like bachelor's programs and things like that, official trainings, are behind the industry? Because I know that's often true in like computer science, for example, where the industry is so much further along, where we're using different technologies that aren't taught in school. So do you feel the same applies for business, where maybe they haven't quite caught up to this technological, revolution.
There's two parts to it, right? And it really goes into thinking, what is the purpose of education? And the way I see it, there's three purposes. One is to learn history, right? Like what's already been there, like collect some of that knowledge that you've collected as a civilization and benefit from it in your life, right? Even if you don't plan to use it like for making money. And then there's the other part, which is how do you use specific knowledge or vocational skills to get a job, to make a living for yourself, right? To learn to provide a service that you can exchange for another thing, like whether it's money or something else, right? Vocational schools have been around for thousands of years as well. Usually they used to be passed down as an apprentice through an apprenticeship, where or even through a family tradition, like, yeah, we are a family of textile workers or farmers or something like that, and we just pass down that skill so you can keep doing the same work. Or you have vocational skills where you go and become a carpenter, or you go and become a painter or something like that, right? Today we call those like coding boot camps, whatever you call it, right? That's how I see it. And the third one is to do deep study of a certain topic, where you're more like doing research, right? So there's three things. There's collecting knowledge that your civilization has collected, right? Then there's the other side, which is vocational knowledge for a specific skill that you can exchange for value. And then there's a third, which is answering questions that haven't been answered and pushing the civilization forward, collecting more knowledge about the world, right? Which is more like the research scholar world which is a different place. And so from a vocational standpoint, yeah, totally behind the curve, like absolutely behind the curve, right? I barely remember anything I learned in my electronics degree, and I'm not that old even. Like, I mean, I think probably 5 days later after I graduated, I had no idea what I had learned for 4 years. Honestly.
Oh my
like,
God.
To put it that
The
way, like
truth
I'll
behind
be
that.
candid, right? Yeah. I did notice something funny that happened in the class once, but that's the extent of my memory of like, oh yeah, that professor said something really stupid, or like, hey, this kid made a fool of himself, or some. Those things are the ones that the only moments from class that I remember. And the rest of all those lectures for like 4 years, I have no idea what happened. It's like a blur. It's like I was like drunk or something like that. I don't even remember. But yeah, vocationally, really behind the times. I think now, today, especially with technology, you can get way more world class education for free online from YouTube than in what passes off for knowledge in some of these universities. And I actually went to what's considered a good university, which is Cornell. Even there, I saw like, yeah, a few people have a course on game development, something like that, but really people are learning online on their own. Kids are searching. Google is their friend, and it's more like whatever they're learning in class is a supplementary rather than the core of what they're learning, right? But I do believe that if you go to a university and you learn, like, you have these books that you're not going to buy or you're not going to find online. You have these people who have experiences that if you get to talk to, you can't find that searching online usually. I mean, partly you can, like some places like Khan Academy, Coursera, they're trying to document more and more of this knowledge. But you have these, like, for example, at Cornell, they have this little small museums all over the campus where you go and you study insects. You go and you study, like, they have a freaking particle accelerator, like 800 whatever, not meters, I don't know, like something about 800, not miles either, because that's like reaching the earth's crust, something like deep under the earth. They have a particle accelerator which is like several kilometers long, and you don't find that online. You don't get to work on a particle accelerator or a NASA jet propulsion lab through a coding boot camp, right? So there's value in universities, and there's value in learning by yourself as well. Long answer again.
That makes a
Sorry.
lot of sense. No, I loved it. It made a lot of sense. And I know we're talking about these different technical concepts, so I want to jump into that.
Okay.
Your whole book is pretty much about technical concepts and relating it to non-technical folks. So what are some of those technical concepts that are essential for anyone working at a tech company to understand?
And this is actually an interesting question because, when I was writing my book, the biggest thing for me was like, how do I structure, like how do I order the chapters, right? What should come
Yeah.
first, what comes second? And because like one thing that I want to make sure was that if somebody stopped reading the book halfway, which I do all the time myself for every book I read, right, if they were to stop reading the book halfway, what do I want them to take away which would still be useful even if they don't read the rest of the book? And so I think the basic one is you have to have a very shallow, broad understanding of the whole software industry, even if you don't go deep into any particular field. So you need to understand what computers are, how computers work at a very high level. You need to understand what software really is, right? You need to understand what the internet is, that the internet is really a distribution system for instructions and information to go from one place to another. It's kind of like a postal service, you could say. And then you need to understand a little about data management, databases, and about scalability, what scalability really means, a little bit about cybersecurity, and a little about maybe artificial intelligence can be, a little later on. But yeah, I wouldn't say it's mandatory knowledge, but yeah, that those are the basics, I think, which are not going to change for many, many years. And then if you get into some of the newer topics, you kind of derive from those. Like if you know about databases, you can derive from that. And so if you know about databases and you know about scalability and you understand those basic concepts, you can derive the concept of a blockchain and Web3 and all these crypto, stuff that's going on. If you understand the basics of software, you can kind of dive into artificial intelligence and how that progresses forward, and data science and stuff like that. So I think with those basics, you're pretty much covered. And then you can relate, kind of like you can draw the line and link the concepts as you go further and further.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think the thing that hit me reading your book is that I've had so many people that I've worked with, like product managers, maybe project managers, who go like, "Hey, Marissa, like, I know what you're doing, but I don't know what you're doing. Like,
Mm-hmm.
can you explain that to me?" And it's always been really hard to explain things like, "Oh yeah, this is why we need to like spend an extra amount of time building the database the right way on the first time," or "This is why we need to spend a week building down tech debt or working on security," stuff like that. And I
Mm-hmm.
think your book puts it in really relative terms where it's like, oh, like a computer is like a kitchen or a database is like a library. And that's how that works. And so anyone who is non-technical, even when you are in the tech industry, this is a great book to just like build that mental model of what these terms mean. So at least when they're said, you can be like, oh yeah, like, that's the library. That's what they're doing. I understand. And so, like, with that, I want to jump into at least one concept from your book.
Sure.
And I know we talked before this call about how, like, even though I'm a software engineer, I never had formal training on databases and just haven't really touched them that much. I've had a couple opportunities, but
Mhm.
your book really helped me build that mental model. So I want to talk about databases.
Sure.
So maybe Aman, can you explain, as you did in your book, how is a database like a library?
Okay. Okay. I'm almost tempted to ask you, because you read the book, to maybe do a drill, and I can work with you on that. But do you want to go with that, or do you want to stick with me explaining?
Oh, it feels like a quiz.
I'm a teacher. I'm a teacher first and
Oh
foremost. So I mean,
goodness.
you're gonna edit this out anyway. Like, so let's give it a whirl. Let's give it a whirl. Let's see how it
Yeah.
goes. All right.
See how it goes. Okay. So my understanding back in the day, you used to go in the library and you'd have that little piece of paper in the back of the book and you'd be like, "Hey, I want to check this out." They write your name in the back of the book and you take it, you have it for a certain amount of time, and then you turn it in. Databases kind of operate in a similar manner in which every like the I'm trying to think of
Yeah.
the library. The
Hmm.
library holds all the books, which is kind of like holding all the data.
Hmm.
And then the name that you write on the book is
Yeah.
I
Like,
can't
so the
remember.
question would be
Go ahead,
the question would be, and I'm gonna throw this in as a prompt,
please.
which is, how do you make sure that books get returned on time, and how do you keep track of all the books you have in the library and all the members you have and those kind of things? So that's the prompt. Okay.
Yes. Okay. So you make sure the book gets returned on time because the person knows the person's name is written in the back of the book, and you also know, based on like the stamp, I think they used to do, know how long you're allowed to have it. And then when you return it, you scan it in and like put it back into the library. Does that sound good so far?
Yeah, you
I'm
have
just
that
explaining
little,
how
you
a
have that
library
little
works.
card. You have that little, yeah. I mean, you have a young audience, so maybe this is actually useful, right? So you have this
Yeah,
little,
does everyone know what a library is?
especially the old school ones, which does not have a computer, which did not have a computer, you know. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, the way I would say it is, you need to have, so when you have a library, you need a certain system to document the information. And what you really care about as a librarian is to store information in such a way that you get the books returned on time. And there are many ways to store that exact same information. You could literally have a list of all the books you have, and you could have a list of like, okay, I have this many books, and each book I have this many copies, and this is the author or whatever, or not, right? And that list could work like, yeah, we if somebody takes something off, like you maybe draw a line, you scratch it out, something like that, or you put a sticker next to it or something like that. And you basically need a system to make sure that books are tracked somewhere, right? But depending on how you store the information, some questions can be harder to answer, right? Which is really the big thing about databases, where if I had to ask you like, hey, how much money did you spend on cabs or transport in the last 3 years? And you would go like, whoa, how do I find that? Like, maybe do I have to gather receipts? Do I have to look at my credit card statement? But I don't, but wait, I didn't actually, I spent cash for some of those, so I don't know, like I don't have that information anywhere. And then you ask them like, okay, well, maybe tell me, how much money have you sent abroad in the last 3 years? And you can say, oh, that's easy, like I can just look at my bank statement and it has like all the credits. But I'm going to have to search, I'm going to have to actually look through each transaction and see, maybe I can sort them by like how big the transaction was, because I'm not sending like $5 abroad, I'm only sending like 500 or something like that. So basically, depending on how you store the information, you can answer certain questions easier or more or harder than other questions. And you have to change the way you store the information if you want to answer certain questions better. And that's the beauty of databases, where the way you set up your schema, like the way you set up your tables, and I think people who use Excel probably are very familiar with this. The way you set up a spreadsheet can make certain questions harder or easier to answer, right? So databases are kind of like a mix of spreadsheets or a mix of like other ways of storing information. You all put them under the same umbrella of databases, but that's the art of, that's why databases are such a huge field of computer science, where the question really is, what is the best way to store a certain type of information? And then the next question is, we know that this information is going to evolve over time, right? So for example, if you want to build a social network, you start out with, okay, like how do I store this information? I have 5,000 people in my social network. How do I store who is friends with whom, who liked whose pictures, how many pictures they have, which one's a profile picture, which one's a private picture, which one's a public picture, how do I store all that information and keep it organized so it's searchable, it's retrievable, right? That's a
Yeah.
pretty open-ended, complex question, and it depends on a lot of factors. And so that's why I see that databases are like this library where, or rather than saying it's like databases are even bigger, a bigger concept than libraries, which is like storing all the world's information in a useful format. So yeah, this was kind of like, again, I'm as all over the place as kind of you are, but that's the beauty, of the
Yeah.
field, where there's so many open ends to this.
Yeah. I mean, also when you're talking about like how to organize data, I'm also thinking in terms of a library,
Yeah,
like when you go to a library, usually you're like, oh, unless you have a specific book in mind, you're like, oh, I really want to read a fiction book.
yeah,
And you go to the fiction section and then you look by, last name. It's like the 3 first letters of the last name.
Yeah.
And then you can scan stuff like that. So the way you build your schema or your library can organize that information in different ways and allow people to like find the right book or the right data in the easiest manner possible.
Yeah. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. That's a perfect compliment to, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, an addendum to your book.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I should actually have that because
Awesome.
every chapter, this is something that it's not out yet, but in the
Yeah,
book, which is actually this is the first time I'm telling people about this publicly, but in the book, every single chapter is going to end with like this interactive, like scannable artwork, which is going to take up its own page. And if you scan it, you'll go to a different page on the internet where you can have more bonus content about each chapter. So that's going to be there as well. So I'm going to
that
put
is
this.
so
I'm going to put
cool.
this there, by the way, like what you said.
So, speaking of your book, where can people find your book to dig further into this topic?
They can find it on Amazon or any other place where books are sold, and hopefully it will be out on every platform by the time this episode comes out. It's called Tech Fluent CEO, and also I'm happy to, in general, give away a free copy, a free PDF of the book to anybody, and you're more than welcome to have a link to that in your show notes, and so you can read a free copy of the book that way as well.
Okay, awesome. I'll put that in the show notes then.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've already said it. I really recommend people read Aman's book. Go out there, check out the Amazon link in the show notes. And before we wrap up, I always end with one final question, which is what is one skill that you're currently working on?
I'm actually working on my skill as being a better podcast host, because one thing that I've noticed as a host is that over time, as you get feedback from listeners, sometimes you get feedback from a listener which is not your core audience, right? And so it's hard to stick to your core audience that you want to serve. And this was in my case because I have so many, it's kind of like a diverse podcast. So sometimes, like for example, case in point, so I have some young professionals listening to my podcast, which even though it's for more of a CEO business audience, and
Mm-hmm.
because I get so many, and they're a little more vocal in sharing, like, oh, I love your podcast and something like that. And then recently I was interviewing this guy who started like 15, 17 companies, right? He's like 68 years old and he's like a very established entrepreneur. And I found myself that I'm asking every question and I'm really elaborating on every question. And towards the end, after the interview, he was like, you know what, Aman, I get your question. You can keep them concise. Like, you don't have to explain so much. And I was like, oh my God, like, because I have a part of my audience which is younger, I've forgotten that actually most people that I interview and most people who this podcast is for is like are pretty experienced people. I don't have to explain things. We can just keep the conversation on and they're at that level already. So that's one thing that I'm like learning to speak to my audience is something that I'm trying to train as a muscle as a podcast host.
Yeah,
I don't know
that's
if that
really
helps.
interesting and super important. Yeah, no, I mean, I relate to that a lot. I'm always trying to figure out the way to phrase questions to make them like as simple as possible. And because my audience is young professionals, so it's like, okay, a lot of these concepts they might not know. I'm gonna assume people don't know most
Mhm.
concepts that I mention, and I do elaborate like you do. But I think for me, I am serving that young professional population versus you are serving like an older more experienced population.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So and
Cool.
also the
All
handstands,
right.
by the way. Yeah, but yeah,
The handstands, yeah.
yeah, for
You
sure.
gotta update me on that. I've thought of doing like a in a year, like where are they now episode of podcasts. I've talked about this on another episode, but we should like come back in a year and you gotta update me on the handstands, and that's gonna be the whole episode.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, we can do a handstand tutorial for young professionals, and how that relates with thinking more technically because it pulls brain into your brain or something like that. That would be interesting episode for
Yeah.
sure.
Work on that metaphor and we will bring you back for that.
Awesome.
Okay. Aman, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I am such a fan of your book and am super excited to recommend it to others and for others who are listening to read your book. For those listening, if you're interested in connecting with Aman or reading his book, please check out the show notes for everything we mentioned today, including a link to the free PDF of his book. And thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time where we'll continue blossoming together.